The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we'll hear two authors make the case against corporate concentration in Canada. Then, journalist Roxanna Spicer recounts the story of a lifetime, her own mother's capture by the Nazis during World War II. That's all ahead on The Agenda. The terms competition and productivity have filled the minds of policy analysts and economists in recent years. But what does it all mean for Canadian consumers? Authors Denise Hearn and Vass Bednar explore these concepts and the growth of corporate consolidation in their new book. It's called The Big Fix: How Companies Capture Markets and Harm Canadians. Denise Hearn is a resident senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University. Vass Bednar is the executive director of McMaster University's Master of Public Policy program and the host of the Globe and Mail podcast Lately. And they join us now in the studio for more. Welcome. Nice to have you two here.
Thanks for having
Now,
us.
you've been here before,
That's
Vass.
right.
Is this your
I'm a
first,
newbie. Yeah.
You're a newbie. It's your first time here.
It is,
But
yeah.
you live in New York.
I live in Vermont, actually.
Oh, Vermont. Sorry.
Yes.
You work in New York.
Yes.
But you're one of us. You're a
I
Canuck,
am.
right? You
I
started your
am.
life in Canada.
Yeah,
Okay. So
very proudly.
That's allowed. Okay. Newbie gets the first question, okay?
Sure.
Competition, productivity, the buzziest words among analysts right now. Why those two words and why right now?
Well, that's a great question. It has been on, at the forefront of national conversation. I think we all recognize that Canada has a productivity crisis, as people have called it. But really, it's a longer-standing trend, and it doesn't just affect Canada. It actually is affecting most OECD countries, where despite, years of lots of stimulus from central banks, lots of fiscal stimulus from governments, many OECD countries are struggling with productivity and stagnant growth. And we think that one of the underappreciated culprits is the rise of monopolies and industry concentration.
To be continued on that in a second. I understand why people who read the report on business in the Globe and Mail are obsessed with productivity and competition.
Right.
Why should the average Canadian or the average Ontarian care about it?
I think the average person cares because they feel the effects every day in their everyday lives. And then we sort of have this mystery, right? We're like, in Canada, I wonder why firms historically underinvest in productivity enhancing technologies. I wonder why we're not investing more in our workers or in research and development. And some people are starting to draw kind of more of a dotted line between productivity and competitiveness, as Denise is hinting at, sort of saying that our firms just aren't motivated to try harder because they don't need to.
Consumers at the end of the day feel this.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
Totally.
There is a term you use in your book, which I confess I hadn't heard before.
Yeah, right.
Kayfabe. Kayfabe. What's kayfabe?
We know you're a professional wrestling fan, Steve.
Deep down.
So we actually stumbled across this. Vass and I, despite how we look, are not also, professional wrestling fans. But we found this analogy, which is in professional wrestling, all of the matches are pre-scripted. You have these characters that are invented with these fake rivalries, fake feuds.
I got the quote right here.
Yeah.
You ready to go?
Let's hear it.
Sheldon, put this up. This is from the book. Kayfabe is the illusion of rivalry. It is what all of pro wrestling is built on. Invented characters and storylines, fake rivals engaged in fabricated feuds, and staged events that are portrayed as real. Everything down to the last detail of a match and a wrestling season is highly scripted. It's a perfect metaphor for markets today. You really think that's what's going on in our markets? It's as bad as pro wrestling?
Well, we do. We think we're living in the age of kayfabe capitalism, as we call it, which is the illusion of rivalry, where it looks like there's more competition than there actually is.
So we've heard about the airlines, we've heard about the banks, we've heard about grocery stores, telecommunication. There's a lot of kayfabe, you would suggest, going on there. Where else are we feeling the corporate consolidation in perhaps less high-profile sectors?
Sometimes I feel like the question should be, where aren't we experiencing it, right? In book publishing, right? In media, in newspapers, which we often talk about in Canada and how that can kind of constrain our access to information. Even places like vet clinics, funeral services, right? We're seeing more consolidation, more of that ownership changing that contributes to that illusion of choice, the illusion of rivalry. So it might seem at first glance we're a little bit interested, right, in counting the number of competitors in a particular sector, as that's our key indicator. Is there enough competition? But what it obscures is, how is competition actually occurring, if it's occurring at all? And that's kind of the recalibration we want to offer.
Let me just for fun push back a bit on that, because you say newspapers. We happen to be sitting right now in a great newspaper town, right? It might be the only newspaper town in North America that has 4 daily newspapers. And yet, I think they're all losing money, and they're all incredibly precarious. I mean, how much more competition do you want? These folks are already competing so much that probably, some of them aren't going to be alive in 5 years.
Well, the terms of competition have certainly changed for newspapers over time, right? The conversation about newspapers is really one about changing advertising, which does, bring in the big tech giants. But when we look at the consolidation of ownership of newspapers, we see that most are owned by Postmedia, Torstar, or Quebecer. But you're right, there are innovations and people kind of experimenting and doing new things in newspapers, but that doesn't change what the trend has been over time.
Do you think, Denise, that readers are really being harmed by this consolidation that's happening in media? And if so, how so?
Oh, yes. I mean, absolutely. For one, you want a diverse media ecosystem and landscape so that you can have access to free information and free-flowing information. And I think we've seen that, recently in the U.S., also in Canada, where when you have this concentrated ownership, they really can direct the course of journalism in ways that are favorable to their own business interests, which may be, in competition with a thriving democracy. One example was, Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, basically mandating that they couldn't this year endorse
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Washington
Post. The
Yes.
Washington Post is not going to endorse a candidate for president.
But we shouldn't be surprised, because this is sort of how the fabric of democracy gets undermined, when you have corporate consolidation in competition with political democracy. And so that's the kind of conversation we want to bring forward. Is this can feel esoteric, it can feel a bit sort of technocratic sometimes when we talk about these policy issues, but they really affect us day to day as consumers, as workers, and as citizens, most importantly.
And you're not buying the explanation from the publisher of the Washington Post that nobody really, no, he didn't say this, this is my view. Nobody cares about editorials in newspapers anyway in terms of who they're endorsing. And a newspaper really shouldn't be in the business of endorsements anyway. It should really be in the business of reporting. That's the explanation.
Is it just a newspaper? I mean, that goes back to, I think, our ownership conversation and who owns what, and kind of increasingly how these assets are part of ecosystems. Back to the harms for consumers. It's not just price, right? Often price is an entry point to these bigger conversations about market power, but it's also the kind of journalism we need in terms of more diversification, more storytelling about corporate concentration in Canada. In the US, yes, we can talk about their population differences, et cetera, and Denise is a dual citizen, as you heard, but there are reporters with dedicated beats that report on corporate power and kind of act as a check and balance. And we don't really have that in Canada.
No.
Our storytelling is in fits and starts and pockets. It's important, but it is something we need more of too.
What's the Cineplex story?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have left? Cineplex has been fascinating us. So Cineplex owns and kind of controls access to about 75% of the movie cinema marketplace, which would really make the banks blush, because the big five have about 85%. But it's also really a gatekeeping story because of their ability to kind of throttle access to film. I never really thought about how a movie gets to the movie theater. And I think I just sort of presumed or assumed that if you're an independent cinema down the street, you sort of just got to pick and choose from a library and sort of put up your hand and pay a fee and kind of get it there. And it's not how it works anymore, right? So as we were sort of diving into how Cineplex controls that access, you see these other elements, other ways Cineplex exerts the market power, like a recent case where the Competition Bureau won and said that actually Cineplex is charging people an extra $1.50 that they're kind of hiding in a kind of deceptive way when you go online. Now, is that $1.50 going to kind of make or break people over time, or cause you to lose your house or something? No, but it's the principle, right, that they're able to kind of deceive us in a particular way, and we think it sends a really important message. I'm sure I missed lots on movies, Denise. We've been talking about movies for a while.
Well, I was just going to add, I think the Cineplex case is a great example where it's controlling access to markets, right, for independent cinemas. They don't have equal access to the same markets. And we see that all across the economy, and that makes it really difficult for entrepreneurs. And that's back to the productivity question. I mean, we have 50% fewer startups than we did 20 years ago in Canada. We have 100,000 less startups now. And there's many reasons for that, of course. We have an aging population, cost of living is higher, maybe it's harder to save to start a business. But again, when so much of the landscape is now dominated by these, old entrenched firms, it's much harder to start a business and then have equal access to the market. So even if you can access capital, which is what we normally think of, being the primary barrier for startups, can you actually scale? Can you grow? Can you access markets in ways that allow you to be competitive? And we think that's a major story as to why, we're having these productivity challenges.
You're the dual citizen, so I'm going to put this question to you because it's a Canada-U.S. comparison. Let's do a compare and contrast here. In Canada, the median age of our top 15 largest publicly traded firms is 122 years old. In the U.S., it's 45 years old. Why does that matter?
Well, because new firms add the most new jobs. So again, this gets to, lower job growth, lower productivity. And then you have these sort of old dinosaur firms that are not incentivized to innovate.
Well, hang on. Old dinosaur firms. Apparently, okay, you pick this part up.
I was like, big dinosaur pushes back.
Yeah. Canadians apparently don't mind the institutional security or comfort that comes with being a century-old company. What's wrong with that?
So as to what's inherently wrong with that, I think for a long time in Canada, we've been sold sort of different stories about security, predictability, maybe some of the national champions arguments. We've also been told that geography is largely our destiny. Don't get too greedy, don't ask for much more. This is what the economy can handle. But again, in terms of stifling entrepreneurship, potentially deceiving consumers, limiting choice, having impact on workers too, there are all these really fascinating intersections of consolidation that again go far beyond price. And for most people, price is a very natural entry point, and it's an important one, but it's not the only one.
But presumably there is something to the fact that Canadians like to drink Molson's, even though it's not a Canadian beer anymore, because they watched Hockey Night in Canada and they kept hearing since 1786. And they kind of like the fact that there's a beer that takes them back to the days of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-great-great-grandparents.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Of course. I mean, I think we're not, anti-storied firms that have earned their market position over time because they're offering fantastic products and services, and maybe there's a nostalgia effect. But I think at the same time, what Vass and I try to cover in the book is that, a lot of the companies that we sort of think about with this storied Canadian history, Hudson's Bay Company is one example.
Again,
really
not a Canadian company anymore.
Right. It's not. Basically we say these firms are not what they used to be because the terms of ownership have changed, and we use this example with Hudson's Bay where consumers think of it as a department store, but Baker says, actually, we're a holding company with billions of dollars of real estate.
Exactly.
So the way that they conceptualize themselves has fundamentally changed. And we think that that's important to note, not just for regulators, but also for us as consumers to really understand how markets are shifting and how that affects us.
Let me play off that with another excerpt from the book. Sheldon, if you would bring the graphic up, I shall read along for those listening on podcast. Here is from The Big Fix. Canadian companies are nowhere near the size and scale of Amazon, but some of our most beloved brands now see themselves less as industry leaders and more as collections of varied financial assets. Consumers think of companies as offering goods and services, but this is not necessarily how companies think of themselves, as they increasingly use convoluted accounting and tax practices that primarily seek to return capital to shareholders. In this way, companies no longer invest in production. They are investment companies. The term for this is financialization, and it is key to global capitalism today. Okay, let's dive down a little more on that. What's the issue with financialization?
Yeah, so financialization happens both at the company level, as you were describing, where companies now, and this is part of how economies are shifting, but they're no longer rewarded for actually producing goods and services, but actually owning intellectual property and creating moats and extracting rents. That's the economic term, where they moat a big swath of the ecosystem, and then they just collect the tolls for other people that have to access. So we think that is a problem. It also shocked me, Steve, when I was thinking about, okay, well, what is going on with Canada's, startup ecosystem, and what about companies going public? And in 2023, there were 135 companies that went public on the TSX, but it shocked me when I found out that 84% of those were exchange-traded funds, which are a financial product. So the majority now of our indices are not operating companies. They're actually just bundles of financial products. And again, this doesn't help our productivity. It doesn't really help us as consumers because we're not getting new innovations. We're not getting Canadian firms that, can operate globally and actually be productive in that way. So I think there's many kind of layers to the financialization story, but that all trickles down to the problems that we're, discussing on the show.
Let me do a follow-up, a very short question.
Sure.
Isn't that capitalism?
Well, we think that the terms of capitalism have shifted, and that, yes, in some ways you can argue this is what capital markets incentivize, but we think that it's sort of gone in a different direction that is leading to many of the kind of ailments that we see in the economy today, and that's a big problem.
Okay, Vass, over to you next. One of the examples of regulating massive everything companies, Meta, Google, etc., is the Online News Act C-18. And it raised the question of whether Canada as a country, this sounds crazy to ask, but was Canada as a country big enough to take on Meta? What do we conclude about that question?
I think Canada is and was big enough to take on big tech in that way. I think for some people, the Online News Act read as what would be called a remedy from a competition case that we never actually had, right? So we see more competition, more antitrust cases in the US really going at how Google obtained its monopoly. Was that fair? Was it appropriate? How Facebook operates, et cetera. Sorry, Meta. I always have trouble calling it that. I think what surprised people, or maybe why for some that didn't really land, is because C-18 wasn't couched in that bigger conversation about competition, right? It's a piece of legislation that fundamentally aims to rebalance power in a marketplace. And in that way, you can think of it as being competition law. The competition law is not just the Competition Act in Canada, but it's sort of the anchor that we maybe project our hopes for how to best kind of regulate the economy. We're not always thinking about how to complement that.
There was a time, though, in that showdown between the government of Canada and Meta, Facebook, call it what you want,
right,
where it looked like Facebook was going to win. It looked like Facebook was going to stare down a G7 country and come away with a victory. Is that weird? I mean, is that completely weird to you?
I mean, I think what's weird is how willing they were, or the company is, to exert kind of its market power and sort of bully an entire country, right? The companies wanted to set the terms of competition by themselves. We saw that they were happy to write checks and contribute money, very important money, to Canadian journalism, but they didn't want to be restrained or restricted by how the government thought those funds should be allocated. They were more interested in picking winners themselves. And that's part of the recalibration that Denise and I offer, right? This kind of fake, part of the kayfabe, right? This fake kind of opposition between free and fair and idealized markets, and then markets where government kind of gets in the way. Typically in areas where we don't have capital G government intervention, private firms are more than happy to regulate and set the terms of those markets in their favor. And I think that's what we've seen with big tech and news media.
I'm sure we all remember at this table here, there was a moment when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying before Congress, and I can't, might have been Orrin Hatch from Utah, the senator, who asked him, wait a second, Facebook, you give this away for free, so how do you make any money? How is government supposed to regulate, challenge, force competition upon these behemoths when they really don't even understand the business model to begin with?
Well, I mean, if you're into conspiracy theories, I have heard that, if you were Meta or Facebook at the time, you would have paid a fortune for that media moment, right? Because it basically convinced an entire generation that government was incapable of regulating. And we've had 40 years of that neoliberalist approach of saying, the best thing government can do is take its hands off because they can't possibly understand these technologies. And, thankfully, I think that's shifting. And as Vass said, markets have rules and they can be set democratically or they can be set by de facto private regulators. Take your pick. And we think in Canada and in the US and, all around the world, as you say, these companies are now so large, they have market capitalizations bigger than many nation states. And we need strong, government regulation and law enforcement to ensure that companies can't just sort of ride roughshod, around in any country as they wish. And I wish there was a different solution. We're not saying that we want to be overly interventionist or that we're advocating for more red tape, but we're saying, markets need to be fair and free. And if you are a capitalist, then that means that they have to have guardrails and those have to be set, by the state.
And this is not unprecedented. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, Ma Bell was in charge of everything. And I don't know, what was 40, 50 years ago, they came and they broke up Ma Bell, which nobody thought would happen. Is that what you're advocating here? Do we need to break up the FANGs? Facebook, Apple, Netflix, et cetera, Google.
It's not the big fix we're putting forward, but it is something we've considered and talk about with other competition leaders kind of around the world. Fundamentally, we're advocating for a recalibration of that entire competition conversation. So
what does that look like, Vass?
Yeah, what is
recalibration? What does it look like?
I mean, on this page, I was like, zoom in on me so I can read you part of it. I mean, part of it is this whole of government approach, right? The big fix is fundamentally a triple entendre because we wanted to have a little bit of fun. And the first thing it speaks to is just the problems that people feel, right? Whether you're in a Reddit thread, making a meme, wearing a cool t-shirt, people are really frustrated, and we think it's really important to pay attention to the direction of that public anger, even though it may not be the source of every single policy solution. The second is these kind of big fixes that always lurk around us, these silver bullets that aren't thus, right? We hear add one more foreign competitor and that's going to kind of unleash the economy and supply management. These are important elements of the conversation, but they're not the big fixes we hope they are. What we'd like to see is more of a comprehensive, more fulsome, whole of government approach that calls on other ministries, not just the Competition Bureau, which is one little bureau nested in the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, but really says that, in finance, in transportation, through the provinces and even municipalities, we need a better eye to both when we make a decision, what are the implications for competition, but also where are there opportunities for us to make markets work better.
The only trouble with that, Denise, is that that's not how government works. Government works in silos, right? Overwhelmingly, the Ministry of Health doesn't talk to the Ministry of Community and Social Services, so they can't take a whole of government approach to problem solving because they're all living in their silos. So what you're asking for is actually something very revolutionary. How do you make it happen?
Well, we do take inspiration from what happened in the U.S. under President Biden's administration, where there was an executive order which created a competition council with all the heads of different relevant agencies, so including Treasury, Labor, everyone was there, and directed not only additional research, but very specific itemized sort of agenda items that each ministry needed or each agency needed to go and do, and then. And then this council would meet on a regular basis to discuss and to sort of report back on their progress. So we think that something similar could happen in Canada. We don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, especially given that this is one area where there is cross-partisan support. The legislative changes to the Competition Act that went through over the last year and a half passed unanimously through Parliament. So we think, this is, and we speak to all the different parties, and we think that this is a great opportunity for Canada, whether you're conservative, liberal, or anywhere in between, to see this as an important issue affecting Canada's future. And that's why we think there's enough motivation for this to potentially break down those silos, hopefully.
And not just motivation, but scaffolding, right? Increasingly over the course of our research, we were sort of very charmed to see that Canada has the foundation of a whole-of-government approach. The Competition Bureau has tons of MOUs with other orders of government.
Memorandums of understanding.
Memorandums of understanding.
We're an acronym-free zone here, Vass.
Whoops.
Yes, memorandums of understanding.
Well, you mentioned the Online News Act. The Online Streaming Act, which also came from Heritage, can be viewed as a piece of legislation that sought to rebalance power in a particular sector. Is that not competition law? The Minister of Finance, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, has been working hard to reduce junk fees in banking. This is part of a suite of interventions that make markets work better protect consumers, and are just good for everyone.
Sure.
And I was just going to say that in Canada's history, we've only had a few instances of blocking mergers, and actually none of that has happened at the Competition Bureau.
It's interesting, eh? Like I guess Paul Martin, when he was finance minister,
Martin.
stopping the big banks from joining.
Yes.
I mean, I read about that in here.
Yes, and there was
that's the biggie.
Yes, and there was a recent, I think back in 2023, there was a construction company that a Chinese company bid for in a takeover bid, and it was stopped on national security grounds. So, so I think, as Vass is saying, we have some precedent, but I think, and I will add, I think that we are in favor of breakups, perhaps not of Canadian firms, because again, they don't have the size and scale, but certainly in the U.S., we do think that those structural separations are really important, because you can see in history when you did break up, Bell Labs, when Standard Oil was broken up and so forth, it really breaks open markets and allows for, again, startups to enter. And, and even Microsoft in 2000, when it was under a lot of antitrust scrutiny, some people believe that because they had that sort of policeman at the elbow, as Columbia professor Tim Wu says, that allowed enough space for a little startup called Google to get a foothold. So, those are the types of solutions that we're advocating for.
Let me, I want to beg the control room for one more minute here, because there are a lot of workers/employees who, when they hear the words competitiveness and productivity, they basically infer that to mean, you want me to work harder for just the same amount of money.
Right.
Is that what we're talking about here?
No, it's not what we're talking about. We're talking about freedom for workers, worker mobility, the ability to be free of non-competes, unnecessary constraints typically used to intimidate people. We saw here in Canada not just the collusive power of the grocers potentially, maybe calling each other around the same time to conclude hero pay in the pandemic.
What a coincidence.
I know, right? It just happens. We also saw Tim Hortons franchisees, staying in touch so that you could not take your labor and skills to a Tim Hortons in kind of the same neighborhood or same geography. Now, these lawyers will tell you these aren't enforceable under Ontario law, et cetera, et cetera. Ontario has since banned non-competes, which to us seems like part of that whole of government approach. But really, these are tactics that firms use to intimidate people and constrain their freedom.
Gotcha. The Big Fix is what the book is called, How Companies Capture Markets and Harm Canadians. It has brought Denise Hearn and Vass Bednar to our studio here today, for which we are grateful. Thank you, you two.
Thank you.
After several decades of interviews and research, journalist and filmmaker Roxanna Spicer is finally telling her mother's story. In her new book, The Traitor's Daughter, Captured by the Nazis, Pursued by the KGB, My Mother's Odyssey to Freedom from Her Secret Past, we learn what her mother kept hidden about her time in the Red Army and beyond. And we're delighted to have Roxanna Spicer here in our studio. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
This story is incredible. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And we're going to start with an excerpt, and then we're off to the races. It was during those Russian nights that I began to write my mother's story. I didn't understand then the connection between silence and sanity. I didn't know yet that to tell it was to relive it. She wanted to protect me and my two brothers as much as she wanted to protect herself. Things slipped out. Fragmented tales with no beginning and no end, but with gripping details that went far beyond the safe stories about her life during World War II that she would share with friends. Details such as a knife-wielding Nazi soldier, rats, forced marches, eating bark from the trees to survive, and the camps. Okay, let's start there, Roxanna. These so-called Russian nights, where you learn there is more to your mother's story than she previously told you. Describe those Russian nights.
Well, first of all, you have to picture me as a 10-year-old living in our house on the just off the number 7 highway in Netherhill, Saskatchewan, deepest rural Saskatchewan. While my brothers slept and my father had also gone to bed, I would hear the sounds of the Russian Red Army Choir coming up from the living room. And this would be my cue to come downstairs and join my mother on the couch, where she would be fortified by a healthy glass of vodka and Kahlua, what we call a Black Russian, and her pack of cigarettes never far away. And she would, this music and this alcohol and this atmosphere, the midnight hours of Saskatchewan, she would begin to reveal bits and pieces of her story. So very, very fragmented, just bits and pieces.
So how old were you when you began to realize my mom's not like every other mom here in Saskatchewan?
Oh, I think I knew that from knee-high to a grasshopper,
Really?
as they say in Saskatchewan.
The earliest stages of the game.
Well, I would say 10 years old, I started to literally take notes. I used to go up after her midnight sessions and write down a few little things about her. And eventually I crafted the first essay about my mother and presented that to our school. And that was a performance, that was one performance my mother didn't come to listen to.
Take a look at the wall over there. We're going to bring up a picture, and I want you to tell us, what is the name of the person in that picture?
That is Agni Rosa Nikolaevna Butorina. That is my mother, and that is her complete name in Russian. In Russia, she was known as Rosa. In Canada, she was known by her Christian name, Agnes or Agni. And of course, to me, she was known as Mom. So she had 3 different faces, 3 different personas. And discovering the truth behind all of those names and putting all of that together is really the quest that I undertook in writing this book, which also took, that was a solid 7 years of writing.
Most people's mothers don't have multiple names. Why did your mother have multiple names?
Well, she was born into in the very early days of the Russian, just shortly after the Russian Revolution, just before Lenin had decided to ban God from Russia. Her grandmother snuck her out from the cradle and had her baptized with her name Agni. Her Russian name, however, was Rosa, for Rosa Luxemburg, who was a heroine of the Russian Revolution. This turned out to be a very fortuitous combination of events, because when Mom was captured by the Nazis, the fact that her actual Russian name sounded Jewish meant she was in high jeopardy. I mean, obviously, we know the history. To be captured by the Nazis and to be Jewish was pretty much a death sentence. So this is when she started going by her Christian name that she was given by the local priest. She started calling herself Agni. So that's the story of those 2 names.
So when you asked her about her role in the Soviet Red Army, what'd you hear?
Well, what I knew was that she was handed an instrument of war called the bazooka. So she and her bazooka helper were responsible for managing this 50-pound anti-tank weapon on the Eastern Front. But as she said herself, when the Nazis surrounded them, there was no time to pull the trigger. In fact, if you'll indulge me, I would like to read just a small section of what actually happened at that moment of capture. Now, I have to, this is a warning that you might want to have your bleeper machine ready, because there's some pretty rough language in this, but I want to be true to my mother's authentic voice. This also is one of the first and probably one of the only coherent paragraphs Mom made about her time on the Eastern Front. This is after the invasion, in the very early days of the invasion of 3 million Nazi soldiers across the Russian front lines. The Germans overran Poltava. That where we've been stationed. They just overran the town. No fighting, just swept. And then the first thing you know, we've been in the middle of the field. They tell you, take your boots off and your trousers and your tunic and keep your hands above your head. And that was the end of the war for us for the next fucking 3 years. Heroes. You fucking heroes. I love that word. It describes so very well everything you feel. I'd like to get a drink.
You've done something there that obviates the need for me to ask one of the questions on my page, which was, I want to know what your mother sounded like, and you just did it. So I wasn't sure you were going to do that in her accent, but I'm glad you did. That's what she sounded like.
That's the voice of my mother that I hear in my head, and that's the voice that I replicated in the audiobook as well. People tell me I've got it pretty close.
How much about what happened to your mother after she was captured by the Nazis do you think you really have a handle on?
I'll never know. I'll never know. What I do know is that I used every corpuscle in my being, every skill that I ever learned in journalism school, every nuance I ever learned from every executive director I ever worked with to bring all of that to bear to unravel her story. And I think I came pretty close. I mean, there are certain elements of the story that I will never be able to get a hold of. That's lost history. But I'm very satisfied that I was able to put together a coherent chronology of a very dramatic 1,000 days in the life of my mother's life.
Your mother had a number tattooed on herself, which is something that anybody who went to the Auschwitz death camp, concentration camp in Poland had. And yet, despite all of your curiosity and journalistic skill, you never wrote that number down. How often do you smack yourself for not having done that?
Never.
You've forgiven yourself.
I never, it's not quite the right question, with all due respect.
Sure. Because you return to this over and over in the book about how did I not notice that number? Why didn't I take it down?
I think that question really pinpoints the quintessential tension that exists in the book between myself as the daughter and myself as the journalist. Strictly speaking, as the journalist, of course, it's the most obvious question. You know, your mother has a tattoo on her arm, and this predates everyone getting tattoos by decades. But this tattoo was very specific. This was a number tattoo. I recognized the tattoo as having numbers, but it was absolutely a family taboo to look at my mother's arm, to ask her about this tattoo. And she, in fact, during the summertime in Saskatchewan, and you know how hot the Saskatchewan summers can be, she would wear long sleeves to cover that tattoo. So we, as growing up in Saskatchewan, in Netherhill, Saskatchewan, understood that this was an incredible family taboo. To the point, and again, just talking about this yin-yang, conflict between the daughter and the journalist, I found myself in the middle of a raging snowstorm in Moscow in 2012 on my first real serious investigative trip to Russia to unlock that part of my mother's story. And I scored an interview with a woman who would later become the recipient for the Nobel Peace Prize, and talking about the co-founder of Memorial, which is Russia's largest, or was Russia's largest human rights organization. I got this interview with Irina Sherbakova, and for the first time, I was going to be able to take those fragments that I heard during the midnight hours of Saskatchewan and test them against the bank of knowledge in this woman's head. And she was, without a doubt, Russia's most preeminent historian, and she remains so. So Irina gave me 4 hours of her time. And we're sitting across the desk as you and I are, and I'm asking her all kinds of questions about the significance of the two names, the changing of the names, and what life would have been like in the camps and all the rest. And I had my coat on. I was almost literally out of the door. I said, by the way, my mother had a tattoo. And Irina turned to me and she said, your mother had a tattoo? Yes. A real tattoo? Yes. Here? She indicated to her arm. She said, with numbers? And I said, yes. And she said, well, that can only mean one thing, that she was an inmate of Auschwitz.
Did you know that at that point?
No, this was a bombshell. It was completely flabbergasting to me that my mother could have held that secret her entire life. And I mean, literally, she never spoke about that.
Your mother was essentially, I don't know, I don't want to exaggerate this, but would you call her a slave at some point in her life?
No, that's not exaggerating. That's not exaggerating at all.
Tell me what that was about.
Okay, so what happened was that after a period of captivity, as a prisoner of war, Germany had a problem. They had 3 million guys fighting during the Second World War. This basically stripped the country of workers. So Hitler decided that these prisoners of war should be reclassified as civilians. All of them should be, not all of them, but a good number of them should be brought into Germany, and they should be used as slave labor. Not just the prisoners of war, but Germany then went into the occupied territories in Ukraine, Poland, throughout Europe, and rounded up 13.5 million people. Just consider that number for a second. The population of Canada during the Second World War was approximately 8 million people. This is an enormous number of people who were forced into slave labor, and my mother was one of those.
After the war was over, did she want to return to her native Russia?
I think she was deeply ambivalent about the notion of going back to Russia. I think emotionally, she never left Russia. I think she was still I think she was filled with a sort of spiritual longing to see her homeland, to once again experience the love to see her sister was still living in the deepest red Russia in the Ural Mountains that separate European Russia from Asiatic Russia. And
how many years did they go without seeing each other?
50 years.
50.
50 years. And Steve, had it not been for the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, she would never have had an opportunity for that extraordinary moment on the wooden planks of the railway platform in Chusovoy, Russia.
We got a picture of it. Go ahead, Sheldon, bring that picture up. This is a reunion 50 years in the making. And they sat there and, or I guess stood there and hugged each other for how long before saying anything? I think you said 4.5 minutes in the book.
It was, that's exactly right. And the reason that I know that is because I filmed that moment. And again, we were talking earlier just briefly about this conflict between being a daughter and being a journalist. This was a real classic moment of conflict. So part of me wanted to be part of this reunion. I wanted to put the camera down. I wanted someone to hug me. But I stepped back. And I gave the platform, literally and figuratively, to my mother. I didn't want to interfere with this moment that she had dreamt about in one fashion or another for half a century.
We have a clip of your mother talking to you about her time after the war. Let's play that, shall we? Sheldon, if you would.
Mom, at the point at which you turn, why did you turn around?
Because where else could I be going?
But why did you stop walking towards Russia?
Roxana, across the Rhine, nobody let me through. The American troops been coming in. But I took a swim.
I want to hear about that.
Yes, I took a swim in the Rhine River. because it's famous river. I've been walking for days. You wouldn't believe.
It's almost like she's saying to you there, you know, she's pissed off that you're asking such a ridiculous question, is what it sounds like to me. Is that how you took it?
I think that again, this was another moment in which she had decided to open up. And again, I had an unmanned camera set up there for a dinner party at my home in Toronto. And just to set the context for this, this is really part of history, the Second World War history that isn't well known. You know, in the first days after the surrender of Germany itself was Mom described it, it was hell. It was hell for the civilians. The railways were bombed out. As Mom said, the American troops were coming in as occupying forces. The British were coming in. And there was no way for Mom to get back to Russia unless, well, she had been held as a slave laborer for 13 months in the last 13 months of the war. She was desperate to get home. She wasn't going to get a ride on a train or in a truck. She decided she would walk, but fortunately she was walking in the wrong direction. And I want to explain what I mean when I say fortunately, because at the moment of capture, in the eyes of Joseph Stalin, my mother and all the other prisoners of war of Soviet Russia were considered to be traitors. The fact that they so-called, in Stalin's eyes, allowed themselves to be captured meant they had betrayed the motherland. So if she had been successful, if she had actually been turned around, hadn't got herself all turned around and was walking in the wrong direction, and she had made it to the Russian occupation zone of Germany, she would have been subjected to the most brutal kind of interrogation in the so-called filtration camps. She would have been automatically assumed to have been a spy by virtue of the fact that A, she survived the camps, and B, that she spoke fluent German.
That's what allowed her to survive, right?
The fact that she spoke fluent German was critical to her ability to survive, definitely. I just want to say about the question of my mother's survival. I've given so much thought to it, and you know, how is it? And she asked that question of herself. How is it that of all the millions who didn't make it, why did she survive? My first thought is, you know, it's very visceral. It's very sort of like comic book hero. It's like, well, of course she survived. I mean, she could pick a handful of kitchen knives and throw them across the room in a perfect pattern around a frying pan. She knew how to use a knife. One of her confidants from Saskatchewan described her hands as mortal weapons. And she was a small woman, but she was very capable of handling herself physically. You know, whatever her physical courage was, her physical strength, I think the reason that she really survived, in combination with her ability to speak German, was the fact that she never lost hope that one day she would make it back to Russia, that she would be home, that she would be reunited with her family, and that she would also unravel the mystery about what had happened to her own mother. So even though the book in many ways, my book, it's a war story. It's told very specifically through the eyes of a woman. But it's also a mother-daughter story through the generations, not just my mother and myself, but there's a story there about my mother and her mother. So it's what plays out on a number of different levels.
And tell us how she ended up in Canada.
At the end of the war, as I described earlier, she was stranded in Germany, in the same town where she had been held where she had worked as a slave laborer for a local German farmer for about 13 months. But the Canadian troops came in with the British, and they occupied the town. And one of those Canadian soldiers was a very handsome guy, a prairie boy, whose name was Jack File, and he And he met my mother. He could speak German. He met my mother and a couple of other Russian young women while they were all out picking raspberries. And he asked her out to a dance, and one thing led to another, the way Mom describes it. And he fell in love with her. He would eventually marry her. But how she got specifically out of Germany at this time was swarming with Russians who were coming, these secret agents of Stalin who were coming to round up the Russian stragglers and bring them back to Russia whether they wanted to go or not. And Mom knew that she would she had to get out of Germany. Not running from the Nazis now, but escaping from Stalin's secret agents called Smersh, and I can come back to that in a minute. So what happened was Jack and a priest from Edmonton concocted a plan to put Mom into a Canadian Army uniform, put her in the back seat of a Canadian Jeep, told her to keep her hands hidden because they're small, keep her head down, keep her mouth shut, and they flew across the border in this Jeep from Bad Salzuflen in northwest Germany into Holland. And that's how she got out of Germany. Several months later, she finds herself in Amsterdam. That is where the photograph that graces the cover of the book was taken. And she's engaged and she got married. So she became one of Canada's, she became the only war bride from Russia officially registered by the Canadian Immigration Museum, by the Department of National Defense.
How long did that marriage last?
That was a very bittersweet and short-lived marriage by virtue of I have mixed feelings describing this because had it not been for the unfortunate accident of what happened to Jack, I wouldn't be here describing the story.
That is the point I'm trying to make. He died.
Yeah.
But if he didn't die and, alas, subject your mother to even more misery than she'd already experienced, she wouldn't have remarried Mr. Spicer, and you wouldn't be here.
Yeah, I know. It's really, I have to say, just to fill this in, shortly after Jack and Agnes got to rural Saskatchewan, they decided to celebrate a homecoming of another Canadian Army buddy. They decided to go for a picnic beside the Saskatchewan River. Jack went in to save a little girl who got caught in quicksand in the Saskatchewan River. He got caught in quicksand and he drowned. But once again, she found herself stranded, but this time she was stranded in rural Saskatchewan. And I do comment to myself sometimes, Steve, that I owe my existence to the quicksand of the Saskatchewan River. Because she did marry my father a couple years later.
Your mother died in a Calgary hospital in 2009, so she has been long gone, as they say. What were her last days like?
Well, of all the sections in the book that I've written, there's that particular scene that I described in the palliative care center in Calgary is one of the few scenes that I cannot bring myself to read. And I know that seems unbelievable. It's one of the few scenes that I wrote once and I didn't change it. So I will relive it for you, but I have to tell you, it's really quite difficult for me to go back there. In the last hours of my mother's life, something quite extraordinary happened, and I was witness to this. During her entire life, her 86 years, I had never heard her speak German. Suddenly, I heard my mother's voice yelling in German at the nurses, mistaking them for SS women, for Nazi guards.
She was hallucinating.
She was hallucinating. I've since discovered, and perhaps I know that you've also done some research into Holocaust survivors, that this isn't completely unusual. Right. That in those last hours, the memory, the brain, it goes back to those suppressed memories come back to the surface. But to be a witness to that, that was devastating.
Let's do one last question here, and that is Russia today. Can you, given what you've written, can you go back to Russia today? You've been there many, many times. Can you go back?
I've been to Russia 13 times in the course of doing research for this book and for a couple of other documentaries. I can't go back, and that's a really bitter irony for me that my mother couldn't go to Russia, her homeland, for 50 years, and now, 30 years later, I will never be able to step foot on Russian soil again, I believe, because Putin has since criminalized anything that calls into question how the Red Army behaved during the Second World War. And this book is a very visceral recounting of just how, as to put it in Mom's words, that it was a miracle that the Red Army won the war the way that the army was the way the army was run. It was a miracle that the war was won at all. I wish I'd asked her more about that. I think that she was referring very specifically to the fact that they were never supposed to be captured. If you were to go to Russia today, if you did go to Moscow, and if you were to visit the so-called Great Patriotic War Museum, which dominates, sprawls over city block after city block in central Moscow, you would not find a single word or a single first-person account from a prisoner of war. As far as Putin is concerned, during the Second World War, there were no prisoners. There were actually well over, I think there were 1.5 million men and women who were captured by the Nazis in the first 8 months of the war. This history has been written out of the official narrative in today's Russia. So no, I definitely would not, I wouldn't feel safe getting back off the plane in the Sheremetyevo airport in Moscow.
Well, he may have eliminated it from the history there, but it's all in here. You've done an incredible job putting this all together. The Traitor's Daughter, captured by the Nazis, pursued by the KGB, my mother's odyssey to freedom from her secret past. Roxanna Spicer, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, October 29th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, will Canada finally build a high-speed rail network? We'll explore that 5-decades-old question. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.